Okay, thank you very much everybody for joining. My name is Tom Butterworth. I'm delighted to have you here today to share with you some of the work that we've been doing and some of our thoughts around the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosure. First of all, as a few people are joining still, you'll note you'll be on mute. You won't be able to shout out during this presentation, though we would love to hear from you. So please do use the questions box and add your questions. And we've got plenty of time for questions discussion later on. So please do make sure that you're adding all of your questions into that questions box that you should be able to see on the panel. Please also note that there is a chat function as well. We'd rather you put the comments on the questions in the questions box. That'll make it easier for us to pick them up and answer them. We'll try and make sure that we cover anything that comes through in the chat as well. So welcome. The last point I just want to make before we get into introductions to what we're going to talk about today is that we also have a handout in the handout section that you should be able to download. I'm going to say a little bit more about this later, but this is our nature guidebook that we published a couple of weeks ago. It's got some really great insights into what nature means for businesses, and we hope that we're going to be able to talk about one aspect of that today, that being the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosure. So let's move on to the next slide, please. I'm delighted to say that I'm joined by some experts from WSP to talk about the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosure. We've been working on the TNFD. Let's start using the acronym. The TNFD through the lifetime of its development, and now we're starting to implement this across a whole range of organizations. And so I sit in the UK and I look after our ecology team in the UK. We also have Jenny Merriman, Technical Director for Nature Advisory in the UK, and Carl Knopff, Senior Principal Ecologist in Canada. Now, these two are going to lead us through this, and I'll let them say more in a moment, but I want to get right into the details straight away. So what I'm going to do, the way we're going to work this is I'm going to ask some questions, and Jenny and Carl are going to then help us navigate through the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosure. So very nice to see you both. Great you're here because it's your expertise we need. Let's move on to the next slide and we'll just give you an overview of the steps we're going to go through today. So introductions, I'm going to let Jenny and Carl introduce themselves in just a moment. Then we'll go through the panel discussion. As I said, this will be me discussing, asking the obvious questions, I hope, and helping us navigate through the TNFD. We've then got an opportunity to have a look at some of the tools that are out there and some of the tools that we've been producing to help us run this assessment. And we've got plenty of time for Q&A, so do keep those questions coming through. But yeah, Jenny, can I pass to you just to say anything more as a way of introduction, and then I'll come to Kyle, and then we'll get into the detail.
Thanks, Tom. Hi, everyone. Just really to say that in my role, I've been supporting a number of clients looking at the initial TNFD that's been produced in various iterations. So really drawing on that experience and some of the challenges and ways that we've been working and sharing that with you today.
Thank you, Jenny. Carl, over to you.
Hi, good morning, everybody from Canada. So I sit in Calgary, and like Jenny and Tom have been working hard as the TNFD has been rolling out to help our clients start to initiate the process of first documenting and then ultimately disclosing, the dependencies and impacts on nature. So excited to share some of that work with you today.
Very good. Thank you. So let's move on and get straight into the detail. What I want, if we can have the next slide, please. What I'd like to understand is where this Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosure has come to. What's the come from? What's the context that this has come from? There's an awful lot coming out on nature at the moment. Loads of initiatives, loads of information. But I wondered if, Jenny, if you might be able to tell me where this has come from. Where does the task force sit, and what is it? What actually is it?
Sure.
If that's
so
not a silly question.
3 questions. Yeah. So I put a couple of slides together just to sort of help frame the context really. So the first one is very recently published work that many of you have probably seen in the last week or so from the Stockholm Environment Institute. This is the planetary boundaries work, which was initiated about 15 years ago, and it shows the most complete update of this year, with 6 of those 9 planetary boundaries being exceeded quite considerably from what's considered a safe limit, which is the boundary of the green in the graphic. Importantly, biodiversity is one of these, has been since the beginning, and the metrics have sort of advanced as this has gone on. But what it shows is that in the context of sustainability, biodiversity loss is absolutely fundamental to addressing the challenges that we need to address in a holistic way. The other context around this, which is on the next slide, is about the relationship of this loss to our business, society and economy as a whole. So with the Living Planet Index figures here, we can see every region is suffering a rapid decline in the level of biodiversity that exists, faster than ever in history. But associated to that, and really critical in the message, is that this is fundamentally impacting our economic ecosystem, if you like. So work by the World Bank, by the World Economic Forum, have all highlighted the importance of environmental risk in the coming decade. So the graphic on the bottom right there is showing in green the number of environmental risks that are coming out as top global risks according to the way that they assess it, and 6 of those of the 10 are going to be environmental. So it's really important that we're looking at biodiversity in the same level of detail as we're looking at climate, and tackling those in an integrated way. The next sort of bit of context before I start talking about the TNFD itself is about the Global Biodiversity Framework. So this was a UN event in Montreal in December, equivalent to the UN Convention on Climate Change. And it set a new 10-year global biodiversity framework, taking us out to 2030, looking to halt and reverse this loss of biodiversity because of the fundamental impact it's going to have on society, and already is in terms of the sustainable economy. There are 23 targets. The most important one to talk about today is target 15, which is specifically directed at businesses, and which the TNFD is really looking to help support delivery of. So it requires businesses to assess and disclose their dependencies and impacts and risks, not just directly in terms of their operations, but also throughout the value chain, and the full text is shown there on the right. So against this backdrop then, the task force for nature-related financial disclosures has been in development for approximately 2 years. And the next slide shows one of the graphics that they shared when they released the first full version last week. This is, as with the TCFD, a risk management and disclosure framework. The idea is to encourage a shift in financial flows away from nature negative outcomes and towards nature positive outcomes by revealing the risks and the impacts that businesses are having on nature. It's been developed with the market in response to market demand, a lot of stakeholder engagement, and it has produced a tome of material which is there to help understand how to firstly assess the impacts and dependencies that you might be having, look at what's material in terms of the risks and the opportunities associated with that, and focusing that towards your sector or the biomes that you operate within, and following a sort of pathway to setting appropriate targets for you as a business, and then obviously monitoring and taking action linked to that. Just talking through this triangle quickly before we move on. Right at the top there is the core disclosure recommendations. There are 14 of these. 11 have been carried across from the TCFD and are the same. There are 3 additional ones focused on stakeholder consultation, looking specifically at locations of impacts and dependencies. And the third one is looking specifically at the upstream and downstream value chain as well. So those are sort of the new contents that are different from what was in the TCFD. Beyond that, it has developed a framework called LEAP, which is locate, evaluate, assess and prepare. There's guidance produced on that, which has also been released, which helps organisations to go through a process. It's not mandatory, but it helps go through the process in order to actually be able to answer the disclosures that are required. That's been sort of thoroughly tested by pilot organisations and a lot of feedback received through different avenues to improve that over the last year or so. Beyond that, they've also produced sector guidance for different business sectors, including the financial sector, and biome guidance. Many of these are quite new and still out for consultation. The finance sector guidance is complete, but some of the other sort of more real business sectors are still early, and I think they are inviting thoughts on the improvement of those going forward. Finally, right at the bottom of the triangle here, there are specific elements of guidance around scenario analysis, target setting, and engagement with local Indigenous people and communities. So there's a lot there, but essentially, you know, tackling the top two is a really great starting place, and a lot of work has gone into the producing that in a palatable way.
Thank you, Jenny. There's an awful lot there, isn't there? So, what I want to understand before we dive into how we actually deal with this huge amount of information that's come through is, and if we can move on to the next slide, please, is we're already doing a whole load of work on disclosures around carbon, commitments around our greenhouse gas emissions. We're looking at a whole range of work on our environmental impacts and so on. So I wonder if I could come to you, Carl, to give us an idea of how this sits within. Is this something we have to do alongside all of those other initiatives? Is it another thing to add on to the top of our very long to-do list? How does this sit with or mesh with the wider commitments that we have on climate or environment and so on?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. And if we move to the next slide, I've kind of prepared a little bit of an answer to this question. And it's important to consider that this will add some workload to your ESG business, but it doesn't need to be an entire sort of, or the ESG element of your business is what I meant to say, but it doesn't need to be a standalone, you know, pillar that requires a pile of work that's completely separate from everything else you might be doing. And so what this slide shows, and I recognize it's a bunch of acronym soup. Here you can see everywhere, everybody seems to have a good acronym for their disclosure framework or tools for target setting, things like that. But we do have a lot of organizations working in the ESG space to develop material to help business navigate the different sectors. So we do see that we have a lot of existing disclosure frameworks like the TCFD, we've got GRI, IFRS, and the TNFD is not meant to be independent of those or to create necessarily more work, but rather to link together with these other processes and guidance and tools that are available. And so it's been explicitly designed to do that. We are still early days. A lot of these programs, if you're familiar with them, you'll know that the GRI, for example, is currently developing biodiversity guidance. You'll know that a lot of these groups are actively working on, for example, and I'll get to this in a couple of slides, but the Science Based Target Network is looking at biodiversity actively right now, so that it is an evolving space, but the intention is that this should move forward and fit together, and we expect that that's what will happen. And each business is going to need to look at how the disclosure will work for you and which elements of the different disclosure frameworks you might integrate. There's a lot of flexibility actually within how you have these requirements generally about disclosure, but there's quite a bit of flexibility about how you do that. And that's important. So you have room within your business to integrate these things, and there's a lot of valuable tools and materials provided by these different organizations that you can use. Next slide, please. And I just wanted to show an example of this. So we have in Europe, so for those of you sitting in Europe, you'll be very aware of this, but the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which applies to European Union member states and is now mandatory. And we'll see compliance required in 2024 for the first suite of companies. And those reports must become public by 2025. So you're actually seeing, in this case, a regulatory requirement to disclose on your impacts and dependencies on nature. And it isn't completely independent from, fortunately, from the TNFD. So we see the CSRD actively aligning with the TNFD, including recommendations to incorporate some elements from the framework. And as an example here, there's just, you heard Jenny mention the LEAP approach that TNFD is using. And so I've pulled out an example directly from the CSRD that shows how they'll understand and conduct materiality assessments very much in line with the TNFD. So again, we are seeing synergies between the different frameworks, and that's a good thing because you may, if you work in Europe, have requirements to report against the CSRD, but if your business extends beyond Europe, you may have other kinds of requirements, and we're seeing these things start to coalesce, which is good. It'll help reduce your overall workload as you disclose on your impacts and dependencies. And next slide, please. And just another example of how things are advancing. So Science-Based Target Network is busy working on biodiversity at the moment. So we've seen them release, they've got a short paper which basically says that they're going to work on it, on biodiversity. So we expect that in the near future, they'll have some recommendations about targets that you can set for your corporation. And of course, again, there's flexibility here and working to set those targets that match the requirements and are consistent, but also work for your business is very possible. Back to you, Tom.
Thank you, Kyle. So let's move on to the next plan and next question. And this, forgive me if this is a crude question. If we're not sitting somewhere where there's a legal requirement, like in Europe for the disclosures requirement, why bother? And I'm going to stick with you, Kyle, to answer if that's okay. Why bother do this? Why is this important?
Sure. And I think that's a really good question because, as we just mentioned on the previous slides, we do have a lot of work that's in progress, a lot that's still happening. Should we just sit back and wait as this unfolds and kind of see where it goes before we initiate action in our corporations to develop an approach to disclosing against impacts and dependencies on nature? And I think the answer to that question is probably not for most corporations, and I'm going to give some reasons why. So if we go to the next slide, we'll see that there are first a bunch of internal reasons why you might want to be an early adopter. And so these are things like the basic principles that Jenny mentioned at the beginning of our talk here. We're seeing a lot of decline in nature. It poses risk to our society as a whole. And so as part of being a good corporate citizen, you may wish to just advance in your biodiversity performance and nature performance to help secure that sustainable future. And a little bit more selfishly, from a business perspective, your business may rely, and probably does rely, even if you're not completely aware of it, on a lot of benefits that nature provides. And going through the process of understanding those dependencies and understanding your impact, and especially understanding how you can manage both of those, is important for the future sustainability of your business. In addition, we've seen a big trend in ESG being very important for attracting and retaining top quality talent, which is an issue for every business, including ours. Next slide, please. There's also a bunch of external reasons to become an early adopter. Of course, regulatory compliance is one of those, and we, as Jenny noted in the earlier slides, those countries who signed up in Montreal at COP15 to implement the Global Biodiversity Framework, did agree to have some form of regulatory pressure on disclosures for large and multinational companies. We're seeing this in Europe already, but we can expect it to happen in other jurisdictions around the planet. Another important reason, external reason to become an early adopter is that the TNFD itself and other frameworks require value chain analyses with respect to impacts on nature. And what that means is very likely those companies, if you supply something to them, are going to look to you to demonstrate good performance on biodiversity as part of the way they make decisions about what they purchase and how they integrate your products into their business. And then, of course, investor and consumer pressure is also very important today, and we're seeing increased prevalence of ESG investments and favorable investments for nature, and investors are making decisions based on performance for both biodiversity, but also based on nature risk. They see that as very important in their investment decision making. So many reasons to be an early adopter of the TNFD.
Thank you, Kyle. That's really helpful. Let's move on to the next slide. I've been thinking about this, and I can't think of any business that doesn't have a dependency on nature, and understanding that dependency and understanding the opportunities as well that are associated with that seems like a sensible thing to do for a business that's wanting to make sure that we're able to carry on in business into the future. So absolutely, I think what you've said is very clear and to the point. So this then brings us to, well, what do we actually do? We've got a ton of information come through. We've got a massive framework, a load of documents. What are the steps we can take to actually get to grips with this and understand what we can do now to start building our understanding of the task force, building our understanding of what this disclosure means, and informing how we work as a business? And Jenny, I'm going to come back to you to help walk us through some of this, if that's okay. Where do we go from here?
Yeah, so based on our sort of experience of the last 6 to 9 months working with different organisations, we've sort of got 5 key steps really that we would recommend as a sensible approach to getting started. So firstly, of course, have a read of some of that content that's been released last week. As I said, you know, there's a lot there, so tackling those 2 documents at the top of the triangle, the recommendations, so that you know what those 14 core disclosures are, and then also the getting started guide, which really was put together in relation to feedback, I think, from many different organisations, including us, that there needed to be a sort of clear path through a lot of that complicated content that was in earlier iterations. So start there, sign up to the forum if you haven't already, because they often have webinars with people talking about experiences and ways of doing things. And speak to other organisations and peers who may have had a look at this before you and might have some advice and some lessons to draw on. The second point is this idea of a gap analysis. That's really a stock take of where you are at the moment against the disclosures. So really this is just saying, which of these disclosures could I actually answer right now, and where are the gaps, you know, within either my understanding of the business, the data that we're collecting and that we might need to look at, the processes that are in place, and the governance. And that's a really sensible way just to see where might you need to prioritise. And in relation to that, I think it's focusing on what might your key risks be. You know, if you break down your business by sector or by asset locations, if you're a company operating in different parts of the world, which sorts of suppliers you have, what products you produce. There are ways that you could quite quickly get to an initial scope to explore further that might give you some sort of initial feel for where your impacts and dependencies most likely lie. The third point is about getting buy-in from leadership within the business. So there is a governance pillar to this, as there is with the TCFD, and it really requires the business to be incorporating the information that's collected on nature into enterprise level risk management, strategic decisions that are made at the board level, and that someone is accountable for that. So if that doesn't already exist, that's obviously an element that could be improved. And one way to do that, of course, is to go through that gap analysis to identify what some of those risks might be, and to really present that business case to the leadership, so that there's a recognition that resource, time, budget needs to be allocated to incorporating this into the wider risk management framework that you have in place. The fourth point is looking at existing data and tools. So as Kyle mentioned, a lot of you will already be collecting information for other reporting requirements, for sort of mandatory compliance in relation to, the pollution or environmental legislation in the countries that you operate. All of the clients that we've worked with have got significant quantitative information already on a lot of things, and that can be included in a TNFD assessment. What's often missing is the specific sort of biodiversity element and rolling through the value chain, particularly the supply chain, but there will be a lot to start from. So leveraging that is the best place to start, and just looking at what you need to build to make it more specific to the TNFD. The final point is then looking at targets. So once you've been able to go through to look at your data, to complete a disclosure and see where you're at, you can then start to think about what are the right targets to set as a business. This is very much linked to the Science-Based Targets Network, which is obviously not completely complete yet, but encouraging businesses to set targets that make sense for them, that are proportionate to the impact and dependencies that you have, and that really will make sense for you, rather than sort of saying, let's protect 30% of land, or let's do 10% biodiversity net gain, because that's what England is requiring developers to do. It's much more looking at what's the right target for us, and where can we actually make the difference because of the sector that we're operating in. The one thing I would say is not to put off setting targets. So I think if you have already, do stick to those, but be open to considering how they might need to adapt, update, which additional ones might need to come in as you learn more about the business and the impacts and dependencies that you might be having.
Thank you. Thanks, Jenny. We're going to open up for other questions, so please keep your questions coming in. I'm going to stick with you just for a moment, Jenny, because I think there's a key piece here. Those 14 disclosures, so a lot of us will be doing some of that around the climate disclosures already. You mentioned earlier, and I know I'm asking you to repeat this, but you mentioned earlier that there's a few that are additional to the climate equivalent. Could you just reiterate that? Because those 14 disclosures are sort of at the heart of the task force's work. Could you remind us what the additional ones are, or the added ones are for the nature-related disclosures?
Yeah, sure. So under the governance tab, there is one on stakeholder engagement. So the feedback on early versions of the task force release was that it didn't really take into account the importance of local Indigenous communities, of local people and rights, and the impact that a business's operations might be having on them and their relationship with nature as well. So that guidance has been developed in consultation with representatives of different groups around the world. I'm sure it builds on existing guidance such as that in the IFC, for example, performance standards. And it really is to bring in that aspect of materiality that goes beyond just your business and is looking at how you are affecting wider society. The other two are in relation to how you're measuring your impacts and dependencies in terms of sort of location and scope. So unlike climate, where a unit of carbon dioxide equivalent is the same regardless of where you are around the world, the impact that you have and the interface you have with nature is different geographically, depending on where your assets are. So that's fundamental to the leap process and an additional disclosure that you have to report on and explain how you've done it. And then the third one, again, is similarly about the importance when looking at nature in terms of your wider value chain. So it may be that your direct operations might not have a huge impact or dependency if you're just looking at what, where your buildings are. But when you start to look at who you're procuring from or who your services are going to, that's when a lot of this falls out. So again, that's a specific requirement to describe how you've done it and also to disclose what you've done.
Yeah, that last one, just to give an example, and this is maybe the simplistic way of looking at it, but one of the differences with the climate-related financial disclosures, if we're using a ton of concrete, let's say, we can measure the amount of carbon that's associated with that, and we can take that into account in our disclosures and our understanding. For the biodiversity, the points you've just made, Jenny, if I've understood correctly, is that we need to understand not just that we're using a ton of concrete, but where that's coming from, to try and understand what impact that's had up the supply chain, because that's where it hits nature, not only in the gases that it releases. Is that a fair way of thinking about it?
Yeah, and it's that screening step where you have to sort of understand how the locations that you either own or source materials from sit with important locations for nature and the potential impact that you might be having on those.
So, okay, that's really helpful. I wonder if we could, you mentioned the LEAP approach, and I know you went over it before. I don't mind which of you would like to draw this out again, but could you just articulate that again so that it's absolutely clear? Because I think it's absolutely central to this. It's not a requirement of the disclosures, is it? It's additional, or it's a tool that can be used to help you disclose. But what is LEAP? What does it stand for? Who would like to answer
that one, Kyle? I don't mind.
Sure. Yeah, I can. Oh, go ahead, Jenny. Yeah.
So L is locate. So that's that fundamental, locate what you've got in terms of your assets, or if your scope is looking at your supply chain, where that ends in terms of geographically. The second is then evaluating that. So it's really looking at, okay, this is our sort of geographical location. What is the impact and dependency associated with each of those? And, from a sort of scale of high to low, which of those locations might we want to focus on? And then that feeds through into the assess phase, which is looking at the materiality of those in terms of risks and opportunities for your business. So you're trying to sort of filter down through a logical process of looking at screening everywhere that you might have in scope, which of those are likely to be having impacts and dependencies of those which are most material, so that you can really then prioritize your action and then your target setting to where you're having either the biggest impact or you're exposed to the greatest risk. The P in that process is prepare, and that's really about how you collate all of that information for reporting, the resources that you might need, the targets that you're going to set as a result of collecting all of this information. So it's a very sensible approach. We've used it on every pilot that we've done. I think it really helps to go step by step through the information that you need so that you can fully answer the disclosure questions. Don't know if you want to add anything, Kyle.
I'd just like to add that, going through that process also helps you to prioritize where you want to start. So it is a lot to handle when you think about all of your business, and you may have a very large business. It may cover, multiple countries. You may have a very large supply chain. The LEAP process can help you focus your initial efforts on some of the places where you're having either you have the largest dependencies on nature or the largest impacts. And it's a useful way to help get you started.
And there's some useful tools as well, aren't there, to help us understand the likely impacts across our supply chains. One of the questions I wanted to come to, and Carl, if I'll kick off with you, if you don't mind, how do we deal with very complex supply chains? What do we do when we've got supply chain that's very long or tricky to track back along?
Yeah, that's a great question, and this is a very much an emerging space to work in. I mean, thinking about biodiversity and supply chains is brand new, I would say, for most of us. And so now we're looking at how clients can navigate something that might be as complex as having suppliers from all over the planet. You might have thousands of different suppliers, and you're thinking, how do I possibly tackle this? Well, I think, again, it comes down to initially prioritization. So you're going to need to look at that supply chain, think again about where and which suppliers may have the largest impacts or dependencies on nature that you want to tackle first, and start with those. And again, I think one of the things you can do is push some of the effort onto those suppliers. And so you're looking to them to help bring you a very clear and concise report on their impacts and dependencies on nature and what they're doing about it, in order for you to make a better decision on which suppliers you will use to support your business. And then you'll be able to take that information and report it out as part of your disclosures on your impacts and dependencies on nature. And so it is very complex and challenging for sure, but I think the key right now is to start relatively small through prioritization, and to work with those suppliers to get them to do some of the legwork for you and help you understand what's going on with their business.
Thank you, Carl. Yeah, one of the things we've been working through is where businesses control and influence stops and starts, and we may well be able to control certain things over our supply chain, but not everything. And so it's about making informed choices within that space that we can make decisions around, rather than thinking we can do everything tomorrow. And that helps us focus on the areas where we can actually shape things. And one of the ways we might shape things is by having that discussion with the supply chain, isn't it? By opening that up and saying, hey, can you tell us more about where you're getting this from and how, and the impact and so on. But yeah, thank you. I mean, it's something that's definitely in development at the moment, and something that I think we're starting to build a more and more confident way of working through. But how? So this is going to be my last question before I start to wrap up, I think, if depending on time. But what's the best way to trial the task force then? So what's the key way to trial the task force to help us understand how to implement it? What's the number one step we can take? I know we've got those 5 steps, but what's going to help us through that?
Yeah, this is a good, Jenny, you may want to jump in, but I'll start with this one. So this is a good question. I think that we've actually seen clients take a couple of different approaches. One way is to trial LEAP broadly across your operation using high-level biodiversity data sets that help you understand broadly, what your impacts and dependencies are. So you could be using things like IBAT that are global but fairly coarse. And then another way is to start at taking a single operation and using local data to build up to your understanding of how you would ultimately understand and disclose against your impacts and dependencies. And both have advantages and disadvantages. And I think it really depends on the nature of your business and the structure of your organization, which one of those you might choose as your first kind of step forward into the TNFD process. I think if you're a very large company with a lot of assets around the world, it might be very helpful to take that global approach to try and narrow down your initial actions to the sites that have the largest impacts and dependencies to get started. Whereas it's also extremely useful to build from the ground up and get a deeper understanding about how you actually would implement fully the process of LEAP and targets and actions at a single site. So both are very beneficial, and I think folks need to really think about where their company's at and which approach might work best for them. I don't know if you have more to add to that, Jenny, before we move on.
I agree. I would just say that it would make sense to do it for your direct operations, of course, but I think you might find for most sectors that the biggest impact that you might need to really understand, or dependency, could sit beyond that. So I think to get a handle on it, it makes sense to start with direct operations because it's more manageable, but then quite quickly look to improve on that, and and show that you are working to push that out to either the core supply chain route that is going to have the biggest impact, because it's one of those key sectors that the TNFD highlights, for example, or just making sure that you're not sort of then sitting back and saying, okay, we've done it for direct operations. It's about this progressive, what can we do next, what can we do better? And I think in that sense, it doesn't then really matter where you start, as long as you're constantly trying to do a more thorough job.
I think that's a really important point, that you don't have to do it all in one go. You don't have to go through all of those documents and go, we're going to do it all over the next month or two, go bang, and it's done. You can take a little step and then grow out from that. We talk in the UK Business and Biodiversity Forum about starting and then ratcheting up over time, so that we slowly build out from our sort of comfort zone almost into wider areas of work. I do want to ask one more very quick question, and Jenny, I'm going to come to you for this. How do you see the evolution of the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosure, and will it follow a similar path to the climate equivalent?
I wouldn't be surprised if they didn't merge in some way, or at least to see reporting being done in a merged way. And I think there's already an example of that. They alluded to an Australian business has released a report that's available on their website, where they actually looked at TCFD and TNFD and did an integrated report. So that would be my kind of guess as to where it will organically go to try and bring those elements together. And as Kyle said, there's a lot of alignment now, with the approaches in the GRI, and the CDP is supporting the TNFD. So yeah, hopeful that it's going to be sort of much more integrated quite quickly.
Thank you. It certainly moved much quicker than the climate equivalent. I think it took 6 years to get to the same point. They've done this in a year, maybe, year and a bit. Kyle, any last comments from yourself before we move on to the last part?
No, thanks, Tom.
Well, thank you very much. Let's move on to the next slide. I just wanted to give you a moment, and this may feel like an advert briefly, and forgive me for that, but the real value, I think, is in talking about some of the things that we're doing over the next couple of slides. So bear with me for a moment. But this is important for us as well, that we are in a position where we are now, I think, the leading professional services firm globally, with the leading environmental sustainable management consultancy. I think something like a third of those employees are on sort of environmental disciplines, sustainable disciplines. This is really important for us. We're taking this to heart. We're running these assessments for ourselves. We're taking it very seriously. And because of that, we're building our skill set as well. And we've got a global biodiversity, natural capital team, nature advisory team that covers all of these geographies. And I'm delighted to be part of that. I would welcome you to come and pick up the phone to us and talk to us about wherever you're based, about your opportunities or the issues that you're facing. We're learning this together, and we'd be delighted to share that learning with all of you. Let's just move on to the next slide. Alongside that expertise, or out of that expertise, we've developed a whole range of tools, from the nature tool, which is an assessment for natural capital at a site level, to Gold Set, which is a web-based tool to help organizations integrate sustainability into the core of their project management. We've got Task Force for Nature-related tools that we are developing as well, off the back of the launch of the Task Force. These are to help us run these assessments, to help you run these assessments. One more slide, please. Alongside this, we've got some really exciting developments. We've got Nature Vista, which will help us screen and assess sites for biodiversity impacts so that we can avoid them. So number one step, avoid the impacts in the first place. And then also you can download in the handout section that I flagged earlier, in the call, our new nature guidebook, and that will give you a sort of overview of a whole range of these bits and pieces, but also some of the initiatives that are coming through, whether it be biodiversity net gain, the task force for nature-related financial disclosure, nature positive, and all of how we can start to bring that together into a really positive outcome for people, nature, and our businesses. There's a few references on the next slide that we'll make sure that you've got access to. So if we move on, please, so that you've got this slides will be sent round. And the last thing to say is just please do get in touch if you've got any other questions or comments. You've got our email addresses here directly. You can email the general general WSP website, and that will come through to us as well. Email address that will come through to us as well. And the link to our biodiversity website there, I think is worth having a look at too. There's some of our examples and case studies there too. So I hope that's been helpful as an introduction. I hope that's started that journey of navigating through the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure. And I hope that you'll pick up the phone and tell us of your experiences, drop us an email, ask us any questions you like. We would love to hear from you. Thank you so much for your time today. And with that, I'll say thank you to Jenny, thank you to Kyle. Brilliant explanation of what we've got ahead of us. And I look forward to hearing from you all soon. Thank you.
Thanks all. Bye.
Bye-bye.